My name is Scott Sopczyk. The title of my story is Family Lost and Found. I'm the youngest in my family by quite a bit, and by about 7 years and 10 years. And growing up, I have a lot of memories of, most of my cousins were older as well, and sitting around listening to adults talk, telling stories, my father when he was young, my mom, different things. Being younger, I listened to stories, and they sunk in. They didn't really pay a lot of close attention to them. It came back to mind in 2009. My mom passed away. She also was the youngest in her family, youngest by quite a bit. And at the time, we were going through the house, looking at old pictures, looking at old things in the house, and it occurred to me, there's a lot of stories here. There's a lot of things. These things have to be organized, or else they're going to be lost. So I took it. I knew there wasn't anyone else in the family that was going to do it, so I took it upon myself to break down some of these things, organize these things for my boys. Whether or not they were interested or not would be up to them, but at least they'd have the choice. It would be there. They'd be able to find some things. So I started on a journey of doing some family research, family history, some genealogy. I'm Polish. All three of my four grandparents were immigrants. One was not. So I started with the ones that I knew. I researched family. I researched different things, stories of my uncles, wrote a lot of those things down. Took them about as far as I could when they came over to this country about 1910 or so. But I really reached kind of an end there. But the one place I really had high hopes for was my mom's mother, who was born here. She was born in this country in 1898. And she was born here. She was Polish, but she was one of the early immigrants, and I knew there would be better records there. So I spent some time researching what I could find about the name. I was lucky because the name was Olaharski, which is a very unusual, I learned, as far as Polish names go. So I thought, Olaharski, I should be able to find this. It wasn't as common as some names are. So I began my search looking for, thinking about the stories that I had heard. And the story I heard from my mom had always been that her grandmother had been widowed and that she married a man named Goody. Taking on that, I started looking up the name Goody. I personally never knew anyone named Goody, but apparently in Buffalo there's a lot of people named Goody, because when I started to look, there were Goodies all over the place. So that kind of put me in a little bit of a tough end. But then I took a different track. I knew my grandmother had a brother who died young in 1932. He was in World War I, and he died early from his wounds. And from that, I was able to get his death certificate. Prior to that, though, I had looked in a lot. There's census records. Census records can be a great source of information. And in looking through it, I did find Olaharskis, but I kept on coming across this name, Caroline. Caroline, the problem with Caroline is she was just a little bit older than my grandmother. So I thought, this has got to be another Olaharski family that I had never heard of. So I continued to look, and then I got my uncle's death certificate from 1932. And the great thing about death certificates is you can trace things. There was the next of kin was my grandmother. Her name is the next of kin at the time in 1932. And then also listed his father's name, which was Joseph, and his mother's name, Mary, whose maiden also listed her maiden name, which was Lesiak. This is the first time I had seen this. So now I had the next generation ahead of me. So I knew I had Joseph. So I continued, so I did my search for Joseph through the internet. Finally, I looked far and wide all over Western New York, Buffalo, where I was from. And I finally found there was a gentleman who goes around a grave register. He takes photos of graves, and alphabetically they're listed. And there's Joseph Olaharski and St. Stanislaus Cemetery in Buffalo. I found it. There was my great-grandfather's grave, died in 1917. Went to the office for the cemetery. Now, this is an old cemetery. St. Stanislaus Cemetery goes back to the early 1900s, and they have an office unlike any office I had ever seen anywhere else. Big, 2-story stone building, big limestone blocks. You come in, and it has offices. This is the maintenance office for the cemetery. They have offices. There's a counter. I go to the woman. I said, I'm looking for my grandfather. If you have any information, I found his grave, but the name is Olaharski. So their sophisticated filing system, not a computer anywhere in sight. A woman goes back to the office, opens up a file drawer. Within minutes, she comes out, little index card. Joseph Olaharski, 1917, buried through St. Stanislaus Church. If you want more information, you really should go to the church itself because they'll have more information about his burial records. So still nothing about Mary, his wife. Not sure, trying to find something about her. So I go to St. Stan's Church. And St. Stan's, they're used to this. Genealogy is popular. St. Stan's Church goes back to the 1860s. So I go to the secretary and explain what I was looking for with the year. I knew 1917 was the date that my great-grandfather died. And the secretary comes out with this great book, this big, heavy-bound book, thick, wearing gloves. There was my wife and my sister, and we weren't allowed to touch it. It was a 100-year-old book, and she had white gloves on, and she carefully opened up the pages, and in the perfect penmanship, that could have been written by nuns at the time, is Joseph Olaharski, date of death, next of kin, Caroline, his wife. This Caroline that I had found in all the census records, the one that I thought was too young to be my great-grandfather's spouse, was his wife. This is 1917. So, this is something new. The person that my mother thought was her grandmother was not her grandmother. It was really her step-grandmother. So it occurred to me, let me go back to the cemetery. I go back to the cemetery, St. Stan's, and I don't know why I didn't ask this initially, but I asked, do you have any other Olaharskis? I have someone probably before 1940. I'm looking for Mary. Anyone named Mary Olaharski? The woman goes back, pulls out her file cabinet, and in less time, Olaharski was not a common name. It must have been alphabetical. She comes out with this card, Mary Olaharski, 1905. And she gives me the row and the place where it was. So we go find it, walk by my great-grandfather's grave, which was probably maybe 100 yards, but I come, and looking in the stones, the stones kind of end. And there's this border of probably 20 feet wide of just shrubbery. And can't find the location that they're telling me. So I looked a little closer, start to look under the shrubs, and I see there's a downed headstone here. There's another one there, and there's another one. This was one of the oldest part of the cemeteries. Headstones had fallen, and it had fallen into neglect. That's where Mary was. Now, I wasn't able to find her stone there, but she was there in a part of the cemetery that had been from 1905, this whole time. Mary, I wanted so bad to go back and tell my mom, to tell my aunts, I found your grandmother. They may have argued, knowing them. They said, Scott, no, but I knew I had the proof. I knew that this is who this was. And I found it, and I'm the only one in the family that knew about Mary. So another thing about genealogy that I found interesting is family surnames. Now, surnames, they're common now, but surnames didn't begin to be adopted by common folk in Europe, at least, until the 1600s and 1700s. And people chose their surnames, and they chose names that made sense to them. They had meaning to them. So someone's name was Johnson, John's son, literally. If someone who made barrels might choose the name Cooper. If someone was in the medical field in the 1600s, their last name might be Leach. With Polish, my name, Sopczyk, when you see CZYK, that means son of. In the first part, S-O-B is short for Sobek, so literally it's Sobek's son, okay? So I found some of those things I found that interesting. Now, before I go on, I need to tell you a little side story about myself. From the time I was very small, I've always loved hiking. I loved to be in the woods. When I was little, I would get my dad. I grew up in the city of Buffalo. Very urban, not a lot of trees. But we would go out and I'd get my dad to take me for hikes. I got a little older. I found that there's a lot of railroad property. I found a cluster of trees on some railroad property. I built a little platform, and I'd go and I'd sit there. I'd listen to the wind in the leaves. I'd listen to the birds. It's just something that I like to do. When I was in high school, my dad worked for General Mills. And every summer they offered scholarships to a school called Outward Bound in Minnesota. And they offered 2 scholarships every summer. And you had to write an essay why you felt you should receive the scholarship. So I did. So I wrote about growing up in Buffalo and my love of the woods, all those things that were so important to me, and they chose me, and I got to go on the scholarship to Minnesota. Today, my wife and I are fortunate. We own a piece of woods in the Adirondacks, and from the time we stepped in there, we sit on the deck. There's no lake. There's just a mountain with a cabin with some trees. It just felt like home from the beginning. So, getting back to the surnames, remember my great-grandmother, Mary. Her maiden name was Leszek. So I did some research on Leszek, and I look at Leszek. I'm looking, I remember I sat down. I read it again. And the meaning of Leszek is said Polish dialect, person from the woods. The objective brain in me says, there's no tree gene, there's no forest gene. And objectively, I know that's true. The romantic on the other side says, bullshit. That's way too much of a coincidence for that to happen. So, and I don't know. But I know that Mary Olaharski, who was Mary Leszek, who was forgotten to her family, her grandchildren didn't even know her. The cemetery even forgot where she was. She was lost to the cemetery. But she was able to make a connection. So I don't forget her again. In her memory, I wear a amber bracelet of fossilized tree resin that came from Poland, where she comes from. So she's not forgotten again. Thank you.